Between 1837 and 1901, Queen Victoria's Britain transformed from a nation where travel meant horses and stagecoaches to one with steam trains, underground railways, and the first automobiles. For the people experiencing this revolution, travel wasn't just transportation. It was dangerous, thrilling, and completely changed how they lived their lives. Here's what getting around was really like in Victorian times, when simply crossing town could be a life-threatening adventure. Hey, quick thing before we start. If you actually listen to these regularly, hit like or subscribe. I always wonder where everyone's at, so comment your city and what time it is. Weird to think some of you are having breakfast in London while I'm recording this at night here in the States. Okay, tonight it's Victorian travel, but before we go anywhere, get comfortable. Seriously, take a second. Adjust whatever needs adjusting. You're not going to want to move once we start. You wake up to darkness. Not the soft blue pre-dawn darkness you'd find in your bedroom, but a thick sooty blackness that seems to clog your lung with each breath. Your thin mattress offers zero protection from the hard wooden bench beneath you. The steady clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones creates a rhythm that might have lulled you to sleep, except for the bone-jarring rattling that comes each time the stagecoach hits a rut in the road. And there are a lot of ruts. Your back aches, your neck is stiff, your legs are cramped from being wedged into this tiny space for the past 6 hours. The coach jostles again, and your shoulder slams into the person next to you, a sweaty businessman whose wool coat reeks of tobacco and yesterday's ale. He grumbles something unintelligible as you quickly mutter an apology. I spent 3 weeks researching Victorian stagecoach routes, and let me tell you, these trips were brutal. Most people today think a 5-hour flight is rough. Try being crammed inside a wooden box for 2 days straight with no bathroom breaks, except when the coach stops to change horses. Speaking of horses, their relentless clip-clopping is suddenly interrupted by the crack of a whip and a shout from above. "Make way! Make way!" the coachman bellows. The coach lurches violently as he swerves to avoid something in the road. You're thrown forward, barely catching yourself before your face smashes into the opposite seat. Unlike your comfy bed right now, there are no seat belts here. Nothing to keep you from becoming a human projectile. "What's happening?" a woman across from you asks, clutching her hat as the coach tilts at an alarming angle. "Just a cart overturned ahead, ma'am," comes the guard's voice from outside. "Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. Yeah, right. You've heard stories of coaches toppling over when taking corners too quickly. The American novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne once complained that his stagecoach in Cumbria was so overloaded he was certain it would crash into a stone wall. For most Victorians who barely travelled more than 30 miles from their birthplace, these journeys were equal parts adventure and terror. The coach begins to slow, and through the small window you can make out the hazy glow of lanterns. You've reached a coaching inn, one of the vital hubs in this network of horse-powered transportation. In the early Victorian era, these inns were basically the interstate rest stops of their day, except with actual rest. 20 minutes, shouts the guard. 20 minutes only! The coach door swings open, and the guard sets a ladder against the side. You watch as he steadies the passengers climbing down from the roof. Yes, the roof, where the cheap seats are. Those poor souls have been exposed to wind, rain, and the constant threat of being thrown off entirely. But hey, they paid less than you did for your interior seat. I mean, seriously, imagine spending hours on the roof of a speeding coach in the pouring rain, clinging on for dear life while your fingers go numb from cold. That's some Victorian-level suffering right there. As you finally exit the coach, your legs wobble like they've forgotten how to human. The inn's yard is a hurricane of activity. Ostlers dart between horses, unhitching the exhausted team that brought you here and bringing fresh animals forward. Porters rush about with luggage. The air is thick with steam rising from the horses' backs, their nostrils flaring in the cold air. "Move along," shouts an innkeeper, ushering passengers toward the entrance. "Coffee rooms to the right. Those continuing on. Be back in 15 minutes or we leave without you." Inside, the inn is a welcome respite of warmth and light. A fire crackles in the grate, and the smell of cooking food makes your stomach rumble painfully. You've barely touched the food you packed. It's hard to eat when you're being jostled around like a pea in a tin can. "How much longer to London?" asks a fellow passenger to no one in particular. "Another day at least," replies a man warming his hands by the fire. "Assuming the roads don't wash out. It rained something fierce yesterday." Another full day of travel. The thought makes your body ache in protest. Not like now, right? As you lie in your comfortable bed, you can travel anywhere in your imagination without the bruises and backaches. The guard's whistle pierces the relative calm of the coffee room. Already? You gulp down the rest of your tea and hurry back outside. The coachman, who's clearly had a quick nip of something stronger than tea, winks at you as you approach the coach. "Ready for more adventure?" he asks with a grin that reveals several missing teeth. Adventure isn't exactly the word you'd choose. You nod anyway and climb back aboard. Now, these coachmen, they were basically the fighter pilots of their day. They had complete control over these massive vehicles hurtling down roads at breakneck speeds of, wait for it, 9 whole miles per hour. I know, 9 up sounds pathetic to us. But in a world where most people walked everywhere, moving at 9 miles per hour felt like flying. The coachmen were celebrities in their own right, known for their skill, their daring, and unfortunately their drinking habits, because apparently guiding 4 horses while perched on a tiny seat required liquid courage. "The box seat's open if any gentleman wishes to ride up top with me," the coachman calls out. "Best view in the house." The box seat, the spot next to the driver, was considered the prime location on a stagecoach. It was a mark of status, and people would book weeks in advance to secure it. If you were lucky enough to sit there, you'd get conversation with the driver, occasional chances to hold the reins, and in winter you'd share the warmth of the driver's rug and leather apron. But no one volunteers today. It's starting to rain again, and even status-seeking has its limits. As the coach jerks back into motion, you settle in for another day of discomfort. But then something catches your ear, a new sound cutting through the familiar clip-clop and rattle. A high-pitched whistle followed by the distinctive chuff-chuff of steam. You crane your neck to see out the window, and there it is, a plume of smoke rising in the distance, a train, the future of travel, already transforming Britain while stagecoaches still ruled many routes. "Devil's work, those iron horses," mutters an elderly passenger crossing herself. "Unnatural speeds, they say. Bodies aren't meant to move that fast." You want to laugh at a superstition, but then again, you've heard the rumours too. Stories of people worried that travelling at 20 miles per hour, the unimaginable speed of early trains, might cause the human body to melt, or that women's uteruses might fly out of their bodies from the acceleration. The reality, of course, was less dramatic, but no less revolutionary. When the Liverpool to Manchester Railway opened in 1830, trains were whisking passengers along at more than double the speed of the fastest stagecoaches. That railway carried over 100,000 passengers in just its first 5 months. "My cousin took the train from York last month," says a young man across from you. "Made the journey in a day. One day. Can you imagine? The entire coach falls silent, contemplating this marvel. A journey that would take days by stagecoach, completed in hours by train. It seemed impossible. That was Victorian Britain, a world caught between the old rhythms of the horse and the startling power of steam. And you're caught right in the middle of this transformation. So let's fast forward a bit, shall we? The stagecoach era is fading. It's now 1863, and you're standing on a platform at Paddington Station in London, about to experience the world's first underground railway. The crowd around you buzzes with excitement and apprehension in equal measure. Ladies clutch their handkerchiefs to their noses, anticipating the smoke and fumes. Gentlemen adjust their top hats and check their pocket watches, the new standardized railway time that has synchronized the entire country. Wait, did I mention that? Before railways, every town kept its own local time based on the sun. But trains needed consistent schedules, so in the 1840s the entire country switched to Greenwich Mean Time. Railways literally changed how people understood time itself. "All aboard!" calls a uniformed guard, and there's a surge toward the waiting carriages. You find yourself pushed along, stepping from the bright station into the gaslit interior of a first-class carriage. The seats are cushioned, illuminated by oil lamps that drip from the ceiling. The smell is, well, peculiar. A mixture of coal smoke, oil, upholstery, and humanity. "I've heard the air down there is positively toxic," whispers a woman to her companion. "My doctor advised against it entirely." She's not entirely wrong. The early underground used steam locomotives, making the tunnels notoriously smoky affairs. One American visitor described it as a mixture of sulphur, coal dust, and foul fumes from the oil lamp above, adding that by the time he reached his station he was near dead of asphyxiation and heat. But the train is moving now, plunging into the tunnel with a whoosh that makes your ears pop. The carriage rocks and sways. The noise is tremendous. The clatter of wheels on tracks, the roar of the engine, the hiss of steam, all amplified by the enclosed tunnel. People around you react differently. Some close their eyes in what appears to be silent prayer. Others stare fixedly at books or newspapers, refusing to acknowledge the strange experience they're having. A few gaze out the windows, though there's nothing to see but occasional flashes of brickwork in the gaslit darkness. The guard pokes his head in at one point. "King's Cross Station, 2 minutes stop." The station appears suddenly, a platform carved into the earth, surprisingly well lit by ingenious skylights that channel daylight down from street level. Passengers disembark and board in a flurry of activity before you're plunged back into the tunnel. The entire journey from Paddington to Farringdon Street takes less than 20 minutes. 20 minutes to cross a distance that might have taken over an hour in London's notoriously congested streets. You emerge from the underground feeling slightly dazed, your clothes and skin carrying the acrid scent of smoke and steam. The experience isn't pleasant exactly, but it's undeniably efficient. And efficiency was becoming the Victorian obsession. Time is money, after all. Stepping back onto the streets of London, you're immediately confronted with the chaotic reality of Victorian urban transportation. The roads are a jumbled mess of vehicles, horse-drawn omnibuses packed with passengers, elegant private carriages, nimble, handsome cabs weaving between them, not to mention countless pedestrians navigating through this dangerous dance. The omnibus, basically a wooden box on wheels drawn by 2 weary horses, was the Victorian equivalent of a city bus. For the aspiring middle class, these vehicles were indispensable, cheap enough to afford and regular enough to rely on. But comfort wasn't exactly a priority. You flag one down that's heading in your direction. The conductor, hanging off the back, reaches out a hand to help you aboard. Inside, the omnibus is even worse than the stagecoach. Straw is scattered across the floor to soak up mud and rain, but it's damp and foul-smelling. Passengers are packed in tight, shoulder to shoulder. The windows are small, and the air is stifling. You can feel the fleas hopping from the straw onto your ankles. "Excuse me, sir," says a woman trying to squeeze past you to an empty spot. Her massive crinoline skirt takes up enough space for 2 people. Someone else's umbrella drips steadily onto your boot. The penny illustrated paper once described London's omnibuses as foul-dragged, close and narrow boxes contrived to carry 8 and made to carry 12. From your current sardine-like position, that feels generous. Every time the omnibus stops to let someone on or off, there's a painful jolt. You're constantly at risk of having your toes crushed or being jabbed by sticks and parasols. The proximity to your fellow humans makes omnibuses a magnet for pickpockets, not to mention the very real hazard of catching infectious diseases from your neighbours. It's no wonder that men often preferred to sit up top on what was called the knife board, a raised partition along the middle of the roof with seats on either side. Getting up there meant climbing narrow steps and perching precariously, with your legs dangling on either side. It was breezy, dangerous, and definitely not ladylike, but at least you could breathe. For the poor, though, options were few. Most walked, trudging miles each day through mud, soot, and fog. Cities teemed with pedestrians, their boots caked with a special urban mixture, part mud, part horse manure, part coal dust. Because let's not forget, with thousands of horses transporting people around Victorian cities, there was manure everywhere. By the 1890s, London had over 11,000 hansom cabs alone, not counting omnibuses, private carriages and delivery wagons. Each horse produced about 35 pounds of manure per day, plus gallons of urine. Do the math. Streets weren't just dirty, they were biological hazard zones. You decide you've had enough of the omnibus experience and signal for the next stop. As you disembark, a hansom cab catches your eye. With its high wheels and light frame, it's the sports car of its day. Fast, nimble, and thrilling. You hail it, and it pulls up sharply. The driver perches high behind you, controlling the doors with levers. These drivers were infamous for overcharging and for rattling their passengers to bits over London's uneven roads. You climb in, immediately noticing how many crevices let in wind and dust. The seat feels, as one Victorian commentator put it, as if stuffed with broken stones. "Where to, sir?" calls down the driver. You give him an address and you're off, darting through traffic at alarming speed. The cab tilts alarmingly as it rounds corners. Through the small front window, you can see horses and vehicles scattering out of your way. This is the adrenaline rush of Victorian transportation, never knowing if you'll reach your destination in one piece, constantly at the mercy of horses, drivers, road conditions, and the thousands of other travellers all trying to navigate the same crowded spaces. By the 1890s, there were new options appearing. Electric trams began to replace horse-drawn ones. The Underground Railway expanded and improved. And then came the bicycles and early motor cars. But those are stories for another time. For now, as your hansom cab rattles toward your destination, take a moment to appreciate how truly revolutionary this period was for human transportation. In just one lifetime, a person could experience the pre-industrial world of horse-drawn coaches and the early industrial world of steam trains and underground railways. The Victorian era witnessed more changes in how people moved around than any previous period in human history. As your cab finally stops and you pay the driver, who does indeed overcharge you, you step out into a London transformed by these new networks of movement, a city made simultaneously larger and smaller by the ability to traverse it in hours rather than days. And as you fall asleep tonight in your comfortable stationary bed, be grateful you can travel the world through stories without enduring the bone-rattling, lung-choking, nerve-wracking experience that was Victorian travel. The next time you complain about a delayed train or a traffic jam, remember the Victorians. Their journeys were our beginning. Railway travel hit Victorian Britain like a lightning bolt. The change wasn't just about getting places faster. It rewired how people thought about distance, time, and even their own bodies. Remember those stagecoaches crawling along at 9 miles per hour? That was pushing it. Horses can only run so fast for so long. But when the Liverpool to Manchester Railway opened in 1830, trains were zooming passengers along at 20 miles an hour. Double the speed. Let that sink in for a second. Is it safe? People asked as the first trains thundered past their farms. It's against God's will to move that quickly, preachers warned from their pulpits. And my personal favourite concern, what if our internal organs can't handle it? Yeah, nobody knew what travelling at these insane speeds would do to the human body. You think WebMD gives you health anxiety? Imagine believing your eyes might pop out if you looked at passing scenery too long. One doctor actually wrote, and this is real, that staring at the blurring landscape could strain the eyes and endanger those prone to an excess of blood to the head. Translation, your brain might explode if you look out the window. Cool, cool, cool. Farmers weren't thrilled either. The sparks will set my fields on fire, they protested. Some even worried their sheep would go blind from the sight of trains, or that cows would stop producing milk. Because apparently, cows are very judgmental about transportation infrastructure. But here's the thing about progress. It doesn't care about your feelings, especially when there's money to be made. And boy, was there money in railways. The Liverpool to Manchester line opened in 1830. Within 5 months, over 100,000 people had ridden it. By 1852, pretty much every major English town had its own station. The map of Britain got redrawn in iron and steam. Villages that had thrived on coach traffic, dead. Coaching inns that had been the centre of local life for centuries, abandoned. Coachmen, ostlers, innkeepers, out of work. What about us, they demanded. Learn to shovel coal, replied the Industrial Revolution, which was notoriously unsympathetic. John Hollingshead, this writer from the time, remembered seeing one surveyor who was working on a new railway line. Poor guy got dragged into a horse pond by furious coaching men determined to stop the tracks. Can you picture that? Some dude with his measuring tools and fancy hat suddenly being dunked like a human teabag by angry unemployed coachmen. You're ruining our lives, they probably yelled. It's called progress, he probably gurgled back. Despite resistance, these iron roads kept spreading across Britain like veins. And they didn't just change how people travelled, they changed how people understood time itself. Before railways, if you asked, what time is it, in York versus London, you'd get different answers. Each town followed local solar time. Noon was when the sun was highest in your specific location. Made perfect sense when nobody travelled far or fast. But trains need schedules. They need to say, this train arrives in Birmingham at 4:15, and have that mean something consistent. So by the 1840s, the railways forced Britain into what they called railway time, standardised to Greenwich Mean Time. I mean, think about that. Railways literally changed how we experience time. Before trains, your day was governed by the sun passing overhead. After trains, your day was governed by some arbitrary decision made in Greenwich. That's wild. And it changed how people thought about punctuality too. Missing a coach meant waiting a while for the next one. Missing a train could ruin your entire day's business. So timekeeping became this national obsession. Sorry I'm late hits different when you've travelled all day by horse, only to find out your business partner left 15 minutes ago on the last coach. But not everyone experienced railway travel the same way. Your ticket class determined whether your journey was a pleasure or punishment. First-class passengers, they lounged on cushioned seats under oil lamps, pretending they were still in private carriages. Would Sir care for a newspaper? The attendant might ask. Yes, and ensure it comes with a paper knife. One cannot be expected to read uncut pages, the gentleman would reply, probably twirling his moustache. Second-class travellers had it rougher. Cold, draughty compartments that rattled your teeth loose. Still better than third class, though. If you bought a third-class ticket in the early days of rail, you weren't even inside a proper carriage. You were herded into wooden wagons, sometimes with actual livestock. No roof, just you, the rain, the smoke from the engine, and showers of burning cinders flying into your eyes and setting your clothes on fire. Wait, what? Yeah, burning embers from the coal-burning locomotive would just shower back on passengers. People would arrive with tiny burn holes in their clothes and skin. But hey, at least they got there fast, right? Even with these drawbacks, people came in thousands. By the 1840s, railways were offering excursion trains, special services to seaside towns or cities for day trips or events. This was revolutionary. Ordinary working people could suddenly afford to visit the coast or attend sports events miles from home. The clergy weren't fans. Sunday excursions were especially controversial. The Lord's Day is for worship, not frolicking at the seaside, they complained. Meanwhile, factory workers who worked 6 days a week were like, "Cool sermon, I'm going to smell the ocean for the first time in my life." I bet some vicar was standing at the empty church, watching the excursion train pull away, filled with his congregation heading to Brighton with picnic baskets. "They're all going to hell," he probably muttered. "Yeah, via Brighton," replied the church caretaker, who secretly had tickets for next week. By the late Victorian period, Bradshaw's Guide was the essential companion of any traveller. This brick of a timetable was filled with dense pages listing connections, fares, and routes. It was basically the Victorian equivalent of Google Maps, except it weighed as much as a small child and was outdated the moment it was printed. Buying a ticket was an experience in itself. For the nervous traveller, you could pay an extra 3p for insurance. If you were killed in an accident, your heirs would receive $1,000 in compensation, which, when you think about it, is the railway company basically saying, yes, this metal fire-breathing death machine might kill you, but your widow will get paid. Would Sir like the death insurance today? The ticket seller might ask casually. Just a regular ticket, thank you, you'd reply, suddenly wondering if you'd updated your will. Very well, though I should mention we had a derailment just last month. Terrible. Business, 6 dead. On second thought, yes, I'll take the insurance. Luggage was another matter entirely. Unless you paid 6p to have it booked in, the railway assumed no responsibility for its safety, and anything over £100 in weight incurred an excess charge of a penny per pound. The sensible Victorian traveller therefore kept to a single carpet bag secured with the leather or parchment label. Paper labels were easily lost. leaving your luggage anonymous and likely to end up in the railway's lost property office, which was probably just some guy's shed filled with forgotten umbrellas and hat boxes. In the early days of rail, baggage guards were stowed on the roof of carriages as there were no separate vans for them. This guard, a title carried over from the coaching era, was responsible for operational and safety duties. Picture some poor soul clinging to the roof of a train going 20 miles an hour, surrounded by people's trunks and hat boxes, trying not to fall off while also somehow ensuring passenger safety. "How was work today, dear?" his wife would ask. "I only nearly died twice, so better than yesterday," he'd reply, still picking cinders out of his beard. Over time, thankfully, luggage got its own space, either stored in or on the carriages themselves, rather than threatening to crush employees. Seat reservations, only if you were fancy enough for first class. Second and third class passengers couldn't reserve a place in advance. The Victorian equivalent of Southwest Airlines boarding policy was show up early and elbow your way to a seat. "Pardon me, is this seat taken?" "Yes, by my invisible friend Lord Wellington. But I see nothing there." "That's because he's invisible. Do keep up." It was also common to buy a newspaper from one of W. H. Smith's railway bookstores. The first opened at Euston Station in 1848. But don't forget to buy a folding paper knife at the same time, as newspapers and periodicals were sold uncut until the 1870s. Imagine that. You buy a newspaper, but the pages are still attached at the edges. You literally need to cut them apart to read the damn thing. It's like DLC for print media. "Oh, you want to actually read the newspaper you bought? That'll be an extra penny for the paper knife, sir." On the platform, the signal bell was your only warning to hurry aboard and claim a seat, and choosing wisely mattered because before 1869 there was no way to alert the guard in an emergency. No pull cord, no alarm, nothing. If someone was having a heart attack or robbing you at knife point, tough luck until the next station. It wasn't until the 1890s that passengers could move between compartments, and corridors and lavatories only appeared in the early 1900s. Imagine being stuck in a box with strangers for hours with no bathroom. The Victorian bladder must have been made of steel. This isolation of carriages also bred danger. In 1864, banker Thomas Briggs was robbed and murdered in his compartment, the first such crime on an English railway. His killer, Franz Müller, was later hanged. The news hit Victorian society hard. Suddenly everyone realized they'd been happily locking themselves in small boxes with complete strangers, with no way to call for help. Women especially were terrified. "What if I'm trapped with a murderer?" they reasonably asked. "Try not to look wealthy," was basically the railway's response. Carriages also invited blackmail with accusations difficult to disprove. So travellers were advised to avoid compartments with a lone passenger. Nothing suspicious about changing carriages when someone's sitting alone, right? Not awkward at all. "Excuse me, I'd prefer not to sit with you because you might be a murderer. No offence." "None taken. I might say the same about you." Despite these dangers, railways were generally safer than coaching. Most injuries to passengers happened when they tried to board or alight from a moving train. The Victorian equivalent of "hold my beer and watch this" was apparently "let me jump onto this moving train while wearing a hoop skirt and carrying 3 hat boxes." At your journey's end, a crowd of porters would be waiting to handle luggage. Officially, tipping them was against the bylaws, but in practice it was expected. As Lilius Campbell Davidson observed, these men were underpaid and overworked, yet almost always polite, attentive, and obliging. So you'd slip them a coin while pretending you weren't, and they'd pretend it wasn't happening while still making it clear they expected it. Very British. I appear to have dropped a coin near your foot, my good man, and I appear to have caught it in my pocket, sir. Most mysterious. At major stations, female attendants were also present to assist ladies and children, because apparently Victorian women needed help with everything, including not falling onto train tracks. Although considering the massive dresses and corsets they wore, maybe they did need a hand. But railways weren't the whole story of Victorian transport. While trains connected towns and cities, getting around within those urban areas was a whole other adventure. In crowded cities, horse-drawn omnibuses became the arteries of daily life. They were basically the first buses, wooden boxes on wheels drawn by two very tired horses and crammed with sweating, jostling passengers. The first omnibus service in England is believed to have started in 1824 by John Greenwood, who operated between Salford and Manchester. In London, omnibus service was established between Marylebone Street and the Bank of England via King's Cross in 1829. Imagine yourself climbing aboard one of these things. First, you'd smell it before you saw it. Horse sweat and human bodies packed together. Straw scattered on the floor to soak up mud and rain, often damp and foul. Fleas thriving, babies crying, neighbours squashed together, and the air getting thicker with each passing minute. The penny illustrated paper once condemned London's omnibuses as foulest draught. Close and narrow boxes contrived to carry 8 and made to carry 12. That's basically a 1-star Yelp review from the 1860s. But for the aspiring middle class, the omnibus was indispensable, cheap enough to afford and regular enough to rely on. For a few pennies you could cross London faster than walking, assuming the horses weren't too exhausted or the traffic too dense. And here's where it gets weird. The very best seat wasn't inside this sweaty box, but up top, on what they called the knife board. Passengers climbed narrow steps to sit astride a long raised plank, with legs dangling on either side. It was breezy, perilous, and definitely not ladylike, but at least you could breathe. Where would Madam like to sit, the conductor might ask a lady boarding. Inside, of course, she'd reply, while secretly envying the men getting fresh air up top. Later, the garden seat design made upstairs travel a little more dignified, complete with modesty boards to shield women's ankles from view, because apparently the sight of a woman's ankle was more scandalous than the horse poop covering the streets. For shorter, more private trips, the hackney carriage or hansom cab was the vehicle of choice. With its 2 wheels and light frame, it was the sports car of its day. Fast, nimble, and thrilling in a we-might-die kind of way. Its drivers perched high behind, controlling doors with levers to ensure no passenger could slip away without paying. But they were also infamous for overcharging and for rattling their passengers to bits over London's uneven cobblestones. Many crevices let in wind and dust, grumbled one commentator. The seats feel as if stuffed with broken stones. And yet hansom cabs became iconic, forever tied to the image of Victorian London. They were the Ubers of their day, except with horses and a much higher chance of injury. Take me to Piccadilly and make it quick, you might order, feeling important. That'll be a shilling, the driver would say. The fare is 6pence and you know it. Terrible weather we're having. Might take the long route to avoid the floods. 2 shillings. This is highway robbery. No, sir, just regular London robbery. Welcome to the metropolis. For the poor, though, options were few. Most walked. Cities teemed with pedestrians, men and women trudging miles each day through mud, soot and fog. Only with the spread of horse trams, starting in Birkenhead in 1860, did affordable transport arrive for the working class. Picture yourself as a factory worker in the 1870s, walking 2 miles to work every day before dawn and 2 miles back after dark, through summer heat and winter snow, through rain that soaked your only pair of boots, through fog so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. Not like your cozy bed right now, with no need to walk anywhere in the cold and dark. By the 1890s, electric trams began to appear, signalling another leap forward. Clean, relatively quiet, and without the endless problem of horse manure, they were the future, though the future was coming slowly and unevenly across Britain. Victorians were living through revolution after revolution in transport. Old ways died as new technologies emerged. The world kept speeding up, distances kept shrinking, and the average person's horizons kept expanding. But what about travel beyond the crowded streets and busy rail lines? What about the rivers and seas that have been Britain's first highways? We'll explore that in our next part of the journey through Victorian travel, from paddle steamers and pleasure boats to the first underground railways and the bicycle revolution that gave women unprecedented freedom. So rest now, as we leave the rumbling railways and clattering omnibuses behind. The next part of our Victorian journey awaits, with new horizons and new modes of transport that would change lives forever. Beyond the bustling streets and rattling railways, Victorian Britain had another transportation network, one that had served the island nation for centuries before steam engines were even dreamed of. Rivers and seas offered their own routes, with their own rhythms and dangers. Water had always been Britain's highway. This island nation, surrounded by seas and crisscrossed by rivers, had moved people and goods by boat since before the Romans arrived. But the Victorians, in their typical fashion, weren't content to leave well enough alone. They had to make water travel faster, bigger, and more impressive. Paddle steamers became one of the most popular ways to travel by water during this period. Imagine standing on a pier, watching one of these magnificent vessels approach, the massive paddle wheels on either side churning the water to foam, the tall funnel belching coal smoke into the sky, the bright paintwork gleaming in the sun. "All aboard for Margate," the steward would call. "Day excursions, refreshments served." These paddle steamers carried crowds to coastal resorts, bringing the seaside holiday within reach of ordinary families for the first time. Before railways and steamboats, a trip to the coast was something only the wealthy could afford. Most working people lived and died without ever seeing the ocean, even on an island where no spot is more than 70 miles from the sea. But by the mid-Victorian period, a factory worker from Manchester could save up for a special day trip to Blackpool. A clerk from London could take his family to Margate for an afternoon. The horizon of possibility expanded with every puff of steam. "Daddy, what's that smell?" a child might ask, stepping off the steamer at a seaside town. "That's the sea air, love. Good for your lungs, they say." "It smells like dead fish." Yes, well, still better than London air. Pleasure trips by boat became a staple of Victorian. Leisure, though, critics sniffed at the rowdiness they encouraged. The combination of cheap day tickets, readily available alcohol, and the novelty of travel created an atmosphere that horrified the more straight-laced members of society. One disapproving observer wrote of the unseemly behaviour of young persons on these excursion steamers where propriety is abandoned alongside the shore, which probably means people were having fun, maybe kissing, definitely drinking, and possibly showing an ankle or two. Scandalous stuff. "Look at them," some pearl-clutching gentleman would mutter, watching young couples laughing on deck. "No thought for decorum." "They're just enjoying themselves, dear," his wife might say, secretly envying their freedom. "Enjoyment should be seemly and moderate," he'd reply before ordering another brandy. Ferry crossings, too, became faster and more dependable. Steam-powered paddle ferries replaced sailboats on rivers and coastal routes, shuttling workers, traders, and holiday-makers across busy waters. What had once been lengthy crossings at the mercy of wind and tide became brief, routine journeys. Take the ferry across the Mersey in Liverpool, for instance. Before steam, you'd be at the mercy of rowing boats or small sailcraft, waiting for favourable conditions, often delayed by fog or current. With steam ferries, crossings became as regular as clockwork. Workers could live on one side of the river and work on the other, commuting daily with reasonable confidence they'd arrive on time. "When's the next ferry to Birkenhead?" you might ask. "Every 15 minutes, sir, rain or shine, unless it's too foggy to see the dock, in which case we might hit it." Beyond paddle steamers on rivers and coasts, Britain's canal network also carried travellers, though in humbler fashion. The canal system was the arteries of the Industrial Revolution, originally built to move coal, pottery, and manufactured goods. But they carried passengers too aboard horse-drawn narrow boats. Picture yourself boarding one of these canal boats. They're long, narrow vessels, hence the name, pulled by horses walking along specially built towpaths beside the canal. The pace is slow, walking speed at best, but smooth and steady. "How long to Birmingham?" a first-time passenger might ask. "About 3 days, weather permitting," comes the reply. 3 days, but only 20 miles. "Aye, but we don't move faster than the horse can walk, and we've got 35 locks to navigate." The journeys were slow but affordable, and with the rise of engine-driven narrow boats later in the century, more journeys were linked to industrial centres and country towns. Unlike the social mixing on railways or omnibuses, canal life was its own separate world. Canal families often married other canal families, had their own customs and slang, and were viewed with suspicion by land dwellers. Kids growing up on canal boats might never attend school. They learned to handle boats before they could read, worked from the age of 4 or 5, and lived in a space smaller than your average modern bathroom. The entire family, often 6 or more people, crammed into a cabin about 10 feet by 6 feet. Privacy, not a concept canal children would have understood. Where do they all sleep, a visitor might wonder. Wherever there's space would be the answer. Children curl up like cats in any available corner. Eventually, the increase of fast trains prompted the decline in use of narrow boats and canals. Why spend 3 days on a canal when you could make the same journey in 3 hours by train? The railways that had killed the stagecoach were now killing canal passenger services too. For greater distances, Victorians looked to the sea. By the late 19th century, the steamship liner was the fastest way to cross oceans, shrinking weeks of sail into days of steam. Imagine standing on the dock in Liverpool, watching one of these ocean-going leviathans preparing to depart for America. The size alone would take your breath away. Hundreds of feet long, towering above the pier, with funnels reaching toward the sky. The noise, too, the clanking of machinery, the shouting of stevedores, the blast of the ship's horn, would be overwhelming. One immigrant described the experience as a floating town where the sea vanished beneath the smoke, capturing the awe these great vessels inspired. These ships carried thousands of passengers at once, from the wealthiest aristocrats in luxurious first-class cabins to the poorest emigrants packed into steerage. "Will we see icebergs?" a child might ask excitedly, boarding for America. "Let's hope not," the father would mutter, remembering newspaper accounts of ships lost at sea. While the wealthy enjoyed private cabins, fine dining and promenade decks, those in steerage, usually emigrants seeking new lives in America, Canada or Australia, faced a very different experience. Hundreds of passengers crammed into open dormitories below the waterline with minimal sanitation, poor ventilation, and food that ranged from barely edible to actively dangerous. Seasickness was a constant companion. With no access to the open deck, the stench in steerage during rough weather became unbearable. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Many emigrants who boarded healthy in Liverpool or Southampton never lived to see their destination. "The smell below decks," wrote one passenger, "is something I shall never forget as long as I live. Human misery has a stench all its own." Yet despite the hardships, millions made these journeys. Between 1815 and 1914, approximately 15 million emigrants left Britain, primarily for America, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. For most, it was a one-way trip. They sold everything they owned to pay for passage, knowing they would likely never see their homeland again. "Will we ever come back?" a child might ask, watching the British coast disappear. "No, love. This is a one-way journey, but they say the streets are paved with gold where we're going." The reality, of course, was rarely so golden. But that's another story. Even as steamships conquered the seas and railways transformed land travel, Victorians were already pioneering a radical new transportation concept: underground railways. London's first underground, the Metropolitan Railway, opened in 1863. Though many people might think that engineers dug tunnels underground, that's not how they did it at first. The earliest underground lines used a technique called cut and cover, which is exactly what it sounds like. Engineers dug a big trench down the middle of the street, built the railway at the bottom of the trench, covered it with an arched roof, and then rebuilt the road on top. It was like creating a subway sandwich. If the bread was made of bricks, the filling was a railway, and making it disrupted an entire city for months. "When will this infernal digging be finished?" a shopkeeper might demand, standing in front of his establishment now inaccessible, thanks to a massive trench. "6 months, sir, perhaps a year," the foreman would reply, knowing full well it would be longer. "I'll be bankrupt by then." "Progress, sir. Can't stop progress." The Metropolitan Railway ran steam trains fitted with condensing gear to help curb exhaust fumes in the tunnels. Notice I said help curb, not eliminate. The smoke and poor ventilation still drew complaints and official inquiries. Imagine stepping into one of these early underground stations, the air thick with coal smoke and steam, the flickering gaslights barely cutting through the gloom, the walls already stained black after just a few months of operation, the rumble of trains echoing through the arched ceilings. It must have felt like descending into some industrial underworld. "It's like travelling through hell," one passenger remarked after his first underground journey. "Yes, but it gets you to Paddington in 15 minutes, his companion replied pragmatically. Despite the smoke and darkness, the Underground offered a radical solution to surface congestion. London's streets were so crowded with horse-drawn vehicles that crossing the city could take hours. The Underground cut journey times dramatically. By the 1890s, a new generation of underground railways arrived. The City and South London Railway was the world's first deep-level electric tube, with its small carriages nicknamed padded cells. Unlike the cut-and-cover lines, these deep tubes were built using massive boring machines to carve tunnels through the London clay far below the surface. The carriages on this pioneering electric line were indeed tiny, just 4 feet 6 inches wide. with no windows and padded interiors, hence the nickname. Claustrophobic passengers described the experience as being packed into a moving coffin. Yet still they came, because despite the discomfort, it was faster than any alternative. The Central London Railway followed in 1900 with the famous twopenny tube, so called because every journey cost just 2 pennies regardless of distance. Together, these electric lines shifted the network from steam to electric and transformed subterranean travel. But for many Victorians, the most liberating form of transport wasn't one they boarded, it was one they rode themselves. No invention captured the spirit of late Victorian freedom like the bicycle. The penny farthing, with its enormous front wheel and tiny rear one, was both marvel and menace. Imagine trying to mount one of these contraptions. You'd place your foot on a small step near the rear wheel, push off, and in one fluid motion, if you were skilled, swing yourself up onto the seat perched atop the massive front wheel, 5 feet or more off the ground. Riders risk serious injury in headers, falling forward over the handlebars, usually face first into the road. Yet they embraced the thrill. The penny farthing wasn't just transportation, it was a statement. Riding one said, "Look at me. I am wealthy enough to afford this machine, skilled enough to ride it, and brave enough to risk my neck doing so." "Have you seen James since his accident?" one gentleman might ask another at their club. "Yes, poor fellow. His face is quite rearranged. Says he'll never ride again." "Nonsense. He'll be back on a penny farthing within the month. Can't resist showing off." More practical was the safety bicycle of the 1880s, with its chain drive and equal-sized wheels. This design, essentially the modern bicycle, democratized cycling overnight. Affordable second-hand models gave clerks, servants, and shop girls a new form of independence. For the first time, young working women could travel miles from home without needing a chaperone or spending money on fares. They could expand their social circles beyond the immediate neighbourhood. They could take jobs further from home. They could, shocking thought, meet young men without parental supervision. "Where are you going on that contraption?" a father might demand as his daughter wheels her bicycle to the door. "Just for a ride with the girls, father, around the park. Be home before dark, and remember you're a lady." "Yes, father," she'd reply, already planning to meet the handsome clerk from the post office, who also had a bicycle. For women especially, the bicycle was revolutionary. Victorian women's clothing was literally restrictive. Corsets, multiple petticoats, long skirts that could easily tangle in machinery. Cycling demanded more practical attire. Enter the rational dress movement, which advocated for divided skirts or even, gasp, bloomers that allowed women to ride safely and comfortably. Conservatives were horrified. Women wearing something resembling trousers, showing their ankles, travelling unchaperoned. The moral fabric of society would surely unravel. Medical experts warned that bicycle seats would damage women's reproductive organs or cause them to develop unsightly bicycle face, apparently a permanent look of strain and tension from concentrating on riding. Some even suggested it might awaken unnatural passions in women due to the saddle. Dr. Thompson says cycling causes women's faces to become fixed in grotesque expressions, a concerned mother might mention at tea. "Does he indeed?" her more progressive friend would reply. "And what does he say about the faces of men who make such ridiculous claims?" Despite the pearl clutching, women kept cycling. The freedom was too precious to surrender to outdated notions of propriety. As one writer famously declared, "The bicycle has done more to emancipate women than anything else in the world." By the 1890s, yet another transportation revolution was beginning. Motor vehicles started to make their hesitant debut on British roads. At first, they were novelties, noisy contraptions limited by law to 4 miles an hour, led absurdly by a man carrying a red warning flag. Imagine that scene. A horseless carriage, basically a carriage with an engine instead of a horse, puttering along at walking pace, while a man walks ahead with a red flag to warn people of its approach. It's hard to see this as the beginning of the automobile age, yet that's exactly what it was. "What's that infernal racket?" a country gentleman might ask as the strange procession passes his gate. "One of them new motor cars, sir. More trouble than they're worth, if you ask me." "It's slower than my horse." "Aye, but it's the future," they say. When the red flag restriction was lifted in 1896, a parade of 33 cars drove from London to Brighton, cheered by crowds along the way. It was the beginning of a new age, the horseless age, that would soon sweep away much of the Victorian transport world. For ordinary people, though, motor cars remained rare and expensive curiosities well into the 20th century. The true democratization of automobile travel would have to wait for later generations. Still, as the Victorian era drew to a close, people found themselves with more transportation options than any previous generation had ever known. From steam trains to underground railways, from bicycles to the first automobiles, the ways people could move through the world had multiplied dramatically. Travel, which had once been the privilege of the wealthy or the necessity of the desperate, became something ordinary people could aspire to. Day trips, commuting to work, visiting distant family, all became possible in ways that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. But this new mobility came with cost too: pollution from coal-burning engines, accidents as people adapted to new technologies, and social disruption as traditional patterns of life gave way to more mobile urban existences. As you lie in your comfortable bed, imagine the Victorian travellers on their journeys, the clerk pedalling his bicycle through London traffic, the factory family on a rare paddle steamer excursion to the seaside, the nervous passenger descending into the smoky underworld of the Metropolitan Railway. Their world was changing at a pace that must have seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. Next time, we'll look at how these transportation revolutions affected everyday life, from commuting patterns to holiday traditions to the very structure of Victorian cities themselves. The journey through Victorian travel continues, each new invention bringing its own possibilities and challenges. The Victorian transportation revolution didn't just change how people moved from place to place. It fundamentally rewired society itself. New technologies created new possibilities, and those possibilities created new ways of living that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. One of the most profound changes was the creation of suburbs. Before railways, most people lived as close as possible to where they worked. You pretty much had to. When walking was the primary mode of transport, living 5 miles from your workplace meant a 10-mile round trip on foot every day. Not practical when you're working 12-hour shifts. But railways, and later horse-drawn trams, changed that equation. Suddenly, you could live miles from your workplace and still get there in a reasonable amount of time. This created something new in human history: the daily commute. "When did you move to Ealing?" one office clerk might ask another on the morning train into London. "Last month. Couldn't afford anything decent in the city. Wife's happier too. Says the air is cleaner." "Isn't it tedious, travelling in and out every day?" "Better than raising children in that filth. My boy hasn't had a chest infection since we moved." The middle classes fled the crowded, polluted city centres for new developments along railway lines. These early suburbs were sold as offering the best of both worlds: access to city jobs with country-like surroundings. The advertising wasn't subtle. Live where the air is clean and the morals are good. Because apparently morals get dirtier the closer you get to city centres. Who knew? Railway companies quickly realised there was money to be made in real estate. Many began building planned communities around their stations. The Metropolitan Railway, which we talked about last time, was particularly aggressive about this, creating what became known as Metroland, a string of suburbs northwest of London specifically designed around its stations. 20 minutes to Baker Street, their advertisement promised. Modern homes with gardens for the price of a cramped city apartment. Of course, reality didn't always match the brochures. Those 20 minutes might become 40 when the trains were delayed, and many early suburbs lacked basic amenities. You might have your nice little house with a garden, but discover there's no school for your children or shops to buy food. Where's the nearest grocer? A newly arrived suburbanite might ask. Back in London, comes the reply. Better stock up when you're in town. And a doctor. Pray you don't get sick on weekends. Still, the suburbs grew and grew. By the end of the Victorian era, London had sprawled outward along railway lines like tentacles, swallowing villages that had once been separate communities. The physical shape of cities changed to accommodate new transportation systems. Railway stations needed vast amounts of space, not just for platforms, but for goods yards, engine sheds, and administrative buildings. Many city centres were completely demolished to make room for these iron cathedrals. The poor, of course, were pushed aside. Whole neighbourhoods of working-class housing were cleared to make way for railway lines. The displaced residents weren't compensated or rehoused. They simply had to find somewhere else to live, usually in even more crowded conditions. "Where will we go?" a mother might ask as the demolition notice is posted on her door. "Not my problem," the railway agent would reply. "Parliament approved the line. You've got 30 days. Those with money could escape to the suburbs. Those without remained trapped in increasingly crowded city slums, often right next to noisy, polluting railway lines. The smoke and soot from steam engines covered everything nearby in a constant layer of grime. "We wash the curtains every Sunday," one woman living next to a railway viaduct in Manchester explained, "and by Tuesday they're black again." The noise never stopped either. In the busier stations, trains arrived and departed every few minutes, day and night. The constant whistles, steam releases, and metal-on-metal screeching became the soundtrack of Victorian cities. Time itself became more regimented. Before mass transportation, work patterns had been relatively flexible. You started when you arrived and finished when the job was done or the light failed. But trains and trams ran on schedules, and factories needed everyone present at the same time to operate efficiently. The pocket watch, once a luxury, became essential for anyone who needed to catch a train or tram to work. Factory whistles and church bells helped synchronize communities, but nothing enforced punctuality like a train that would leave without you. The 742 waits for no man, as one railway poster ominously warned. Missing your train didn't just mean being late, it could mean losing your job. Employers had little sympathy for transportation woes when there were plenty of unemployed people eager to take your place. "But the train was delayed," a worker might protest. "Then you should have taken an earlier one," comes the unsympathetic reply. "Half-days' wages docked." The rigid time discipline of industrial work enforced by transportation schedules created a new consciousness of time. Minutes mattered in a way they never had before. Being on time became a moral virtue, while being late marked you as unreliable or lazy. This time discipline extended to personal lives too. Social calls, previously flexible affairs that might last hours, became more structured. You arrived when you said you would and left when you needed to catch your return transport. Even leisure became scheduled. "We must leave by 9:30 to catch the last omnibus," a dinner guest might say, checking their watch. "But you've barely touched your dessert." Better hungry than stranded. Transportation didn't just change when people did things, it changed what they did altogether. The concept of the day trip or weekend excursion was born with railway excursion tickets. Working families who would never have ventured beyond their neighbourhoods could suddenly afford occasional outings to the seaside or countryside. Imagine being a child from the industrial north, who had only ever known smoky factories and crowded streets, suddenly seeing the ocean for the first time. The vastness of it, the smell of salt, the feel of sand between your toes, the taste of unfamiliar seaside treats like whelks or candy floss. "Is this heaven?" a child might ask, standing on Blackpool beach. "No, love," the mother would reply, "but it's not Manchester, and that's good enough for today." These excursions created new patterns of mass tourism. Resorts like Blackpool, Brighton and Margate boomed, building piers, promenades and entertainments specifically for day trippers and short-stay visitors. The English seaside holiday, that curious tradition of determined enjoyment regardless of weather, was born from railway accessibility. The bank holidays established in 1871 gave working people guaranteed days off, and many used them for these excursions. Railway companies scheduled special services, sometimes running hundreds of extra trains to popular destinations on holiday weekends. The crush could be incredible. One observer at Blackpool noted that on August Bank Holiday 1895, some 100,000 visitors arrived in the town between morning and midday. For perspective, Blackpool's normal population was about 35,000. "You can't see the beach for the bodies," as one local complained. But these crowds represented something remarkable. Ordinary people, many of whom had never travelled more than a few miles from home in previous generations, now exploring their country in unprecedented numbers. Transportation also changed how people formed relationships. Before cheap mass transit, most people married someone from their immediate area, often from the same village or neighbourhood. Your choice of potential partners was limited to who you could physically meet on a regular basis. Railways and urban transit expanded that circle dramatically. Young men and women could meet potential partners from much further afield. Social networks expanded. Even chaperoned young ladies might find opportunities for romantic connections on train journeys or at railway station refreshment rooms. "Did you see how that young man looked at you?" a friend might tease. "Hush, mother will hear you. He's getting off at our station. Perhaps we'll see him at the church social." For working-class women especially, new transportation options offered unprecedented independence. A shop girl who could take an omnibus or tram had far more employment options than one restricted to walking distance. This economic independence translated to greater social freedom too. Not everyone was happy about these changes, of course. Social conservatives fretted about the moral dangers of mobility. Young people travelling unchaperoned, women moving about the city alone, people meeting strangers from different social backgrounds. Clearly the end of civilization was at hand. One pearl-clutching editorial from 1865 lamented, "The railway carriage has become a venue for the most promiscuous mingling of classes and sexes, where impressionable young women may be subjected to hours of conversation with persons of whom their parents know nothing. God forbid young women talk to strangers. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to vote." Despite these moral panics, the integration continued. Transportation technologies became more accessible to more people as the century progressed. What had been luxuries became necessities. What had been occasional treats became daily routines. The physical toll of Victorian travel shouldn't be overlooked, though. Even with technological improvements, getting around was often an exhausting, uncomfortable experience. Railway carriages were draughty in winter and stifling in summer. Omnibuses jolted passengers over cobblestones. Underground railways filled lungs with smoke and eyes with cinders. Motion sickness was a constant companion for many travellers. Victorian pharmacies did a roaring trade in remedies for railway sickness or omnibus nausea. Most contained some combination of alcohol, opiates, and herbal extracts, which probably didn't cure the nausea but might make you too intoxicated to care. "Take 2 spoonfuls before boarding," the label might advise. "May cause drowsiness. Do not operate machinery." Since you were on a train or omnibus, operating machinery wasn't your problem, though staying conscious might become one. The physical environment of Victorian cities was transformed by transportation needs. Streets had to be widened to accommodate more traffic. Horse trams needed special tracks laid in the roadway. Underground railways required ventilation shafts and station entrances. Omnibus stops and cab ranks needed designated spaces, and let's not forget the horses. In 1900, London alone had an estimated 300,000 horses working in transportation. Each horse produced about 15-35 pounds of manure per day, plus several gallons of urine. Do the math on that. Actually, don't. It's too disgusting. This equine waste created a persistent public health crisis. Streets were literally covered in manure, which dried in summer to create toxic dust and turned into hazardous slurry when it rained. Teams of sweepers, often children, worked constantly to clear crossings so pedestrians could pass without soiling their clothes. "Watch your step, ma'am," a crossing sweeper might call, holding out his hand for a tip after clearing a path. "Disgusting business," she might reply, dropping a halfpenny in his palm while lifting her skirts clear of the muck. "Better than breathing it when it dries, ma'am." The smell of Victorian cities must have been overwhelming. Horse manure, industrial smoke, coal fires, unwashed bodies, open sewers, a miasma of stench that we can hardly imagine today from our clean, comfortable beds. By the 1880s and 90s, the problem of horse-drawn transportation were becoming unsustainable. Major cities were literally drowning in manure. Streets were dangerously overcrowded. Horses themselves suffered terribly. Their average working lifespan in urban transport was only about 3 to 4 years before they broke down from exhaustion or injury. The electric tram and motor vehicle didn't just offer technological improvements, they promised salvation from the great horse manure crisis. When we look back romantically at horse-drawn vehicles, we're forgetting the very real problems they created. For the Victorian traveller, the sensory experience of getting around was immersive and often overwhelming. The sounds alone would startle modern ears. The constant clop of thousands of hooves on cobblestones, the crack of whips, the jangling of harnesses, the shouts of drivers, the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels, the hiss of steam, the clang of tram bells, and the warning cries of "Mind your way!" The visual landscape was equally chaotic. streets teeming with every type of vehicle, from luxury carriages to heavy drays, from omnibuses to costermongers' barrows, horses of every size and condition, from magnificent matched teams pulling wealthy carriages to pitiful broken-down nags hauling overloaded carts. Add to this the tactile experience, the jolting and swaying of vehicles over uneven surfaces, the press of bodies in crowded conveyances, the occasional shower of mud from passing wheels, the constant vigilance needed to avoid being run over when crossing streets. I saw a man crushed between two omnibuses on Oxford Street yesterday, one gentleman might remark casually over breakfast. Third such incident this month. They really must do something about the traffic, his wife replies, buttering her toast. Did they catch his name? No, poor fellow was quite unrecognisable by the end of it. Such accidents were frighteningly common. Road safety regulations barely existed. Traffic moved in all directions. Pedestrians took their lives in their hands every time they crossed busy streets. In 1866, a traffic count at London Bridge recorded over 20,000 people on foot and 4,183 vehicles crossing during a 12-hour period. Not a single traffic light or stop sign existed to control this flow. It was survival of the fastest, and pedestrians were at the bottom of the food chain. For women, Victorian transportation presented particular challenges. The elaborate clothing of the period, long skirts, multiple petticoats, corsets, bustles, was actively dangerous around moving vehicles. Skirts could catch in wheels or carriage steps. Corsets restricted movement and breathing, making it difficult to react quickly to danger. Even the fashionable veils many women wore limited peripheral vision. "Did you hear about Mrs. Harrington?" one lady might ask another. "No, what happened?" "Her skirt caught in a carriage wheel, pulled her right under. She's lost an arm." "How dreadful! But this is why I always take a cab rather than the omnibus. So much safer." The risk wasn't preventing women from travelling. Necessity demanded it. But it added an extra layer of danger and anxiety to everyday journeys. Class differences in transportation experiences were stark. A wealthy woman would travel in a private carriage with a skilled driver and matched horses, protected from weather, traffic, and unwanted contact. A working-class woman would walk or take crowded public transport, exposed to harassment, pollution, and accidents. These differences extended to every aspect of travel. First-class railway passengers enjoyed spacious, upholstered compartments and attentive service. Third-class passengers were crammed into bare wooden benches, often in open carriages exposed to weather and engine smoke. "I accidentally entered a third-class carriage at York," one gentleman confessed to friends. "The experience was most educational." "In what way?" his companion asked. "I now know 7 new words for idiot, and can accurately describe the smell of unwashed navvies after a week's hard labour. I do not recommend broadening one's horizons quite so thoroughly." But even as these class distinctions remained rigid in theory, transportation was creating new kinds of social mixing. People from different backgrounds were forced into proximity on omnibuses, in railway stations, and in underground carriages. The strict barriers that separated classes in other aspects of Victorian life became more permeable in transit spaces. A factory girl might find herself seated next to a barrister on a crowded omnibus. A clerk might share a railway compartment with an aristocrat. These brief encounters rarely led to lasting connections, but they created moments of awareness that would have been impossible in more segregated environments. By the end of the Victorian era, the landscape of Britain had been irreversibly altered by transportation networks. Railways cut across the countryside on embankments and viaducts. Urban streets were widened and straightened to accommodate more traffic. Canals linked industrial centres. Ports expanded to handle more and larger ships. The human geography changed too. Population shifted as transportation made new areas accessible. The strict boundaries between town and country blurred as suburbs spread along transport corridors. Communities that had been isolated for centuries were suddenly connected to national networks of commerce and communication. For individual Victorians, these changes meant different things depending on their circumstances. For some, new transportation brought opportunity, leisure, and expanded horizons. For others, it meant displacement, danger, and the destruction of traditional ways of life. As the 19th century drew to a close and the Victorian era ended with the Queen's death in 1901, Britain had been transformed from a collection of relatively isolated local communities into an interconnected network. The transportation revolution had shrunk distances, accelerated the pace of life, and created new patterns of work, leisure, and social interaction. Next time, we'll look at how these Victorian transportation innovations created the foundations of the modern systems we use today, and explore the final transformations that would take Britain from the age of steam and horses into the automobile era. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those Victorian travellers, the commuters on early morning trains, the families on seaside excursions, the women experiencing new freedoms through mobility, all moving through a world that was changing around them at unprecedented speed, carried forward on iron rails and wooden wheels into the modern age. As the Victorian era drew to a close, transportation stood at a fascinating crossroads. The foundations of modern travel systems had been laid, but the full transformation was still unfolding. It was a world caught between old and new, where horses still dominated city streets even as the first automobiles puttered between them. Let's spend a moment really picturing a major Victorian street in, say, 1895. Close your eyes. Well, not literally. You still need to read this. But imagine yourself standing on a London thoroughfare like Oxford Street or the Strand. The sensory assault would hit you immediately. The noise, constant overlapping sounds of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones, horses' hooves creating a never-ending percussion, drivers shouting, street vendors calling their wares. The smell, that distinctive blend of horse manure, coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and food from street cellars. The motion, the kaleidoscopic movement of vehicles and pedestrians flowing around each other in seemingly chaotic patterns. It would be exhausting just to stand there and take it all in. Is it always this crowded? A visitor from the countryside might ask. This is nothing, a Londoner would reply. You should see it at 5 o'clock when the offices close. The street itself would be packed with a remarkable variety of vehicles, hansom cabs weaving through traffic, heavy omnibuses lumbering along their routes, delivery wagons of every description, private carriages ranging from luxurious to ramshackle, costermongers' barrows being pushed by hand, and occasionally a daring cyclist navigating through the chaos. All of these vehicles, except the bicycle, were powered by horses. The sheer number of horses needed to keep Victorian cities moving was staggering. London in the late Victorian period had hundreds of thousands of working horses, many of them dedicated to transportation. These weren't the sleek, well-groomed horses you might imagine. Working horses in Victorian cities were often pitiful creatures, overworked, underfed, and frequently mistreated. They rarely lived more than a few years in urban service before breaking down. The average working life of a London omnibus horse was about 4 years before it was too worn out to continue. "That animal can barely stand," a concerned passer-by might remark, pointing to an exhausted omnibus horse. "They'll work it till it drops," would come the reply, "then replace it, cheaper than resting them properly." Organisations like the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1824, fought to improve conditions for these animals, but the economics of transport businesses often worked against animal welfare. Horses were treated as disposable machinery rather than living creatures. The streets themselves were a hazard, not just for horses, but for everyone. Victorian road surfaces were primarily cobblestone or macadam, layers of crushed stone. Both became treacherously slippery when wet or icy. Horses frequently fell, sometimes breaking legs that would lead to immediate destruction. Pedestrians slipped and injured themselves. Carriage wheels lost traction, and vehicles collided. "Did you hear about the pile-up on London Bridge yesterday?" one businessman might ask another. "No, what happened?" Brewery dray horse went down on the ice, took 3 omnibuses and a milk cart with it. Traffic backed up to Southwark. Anyone hurt? 2 passengers with broken arms, a coachman with a nasty head wound, and they had to shoot the horse on the spot. Poor beast. Such incidents were everyday occurrences in Victorian cities. Traffic accidents were so common, they rarely made the news unless they involved multiple fatalities or someone important. By the 1890s, it was becoming clear that horse-drawn transportation had reached its limits in urban areas. The problems were numerous. The public health issues from manure, the limited speed, the expense of maintaining thousands of horses, the traffic congestion, and the sheer inhumanity of working animals to death. The search for alternatives had been ongoing for decades. Steam had conquered long-distance travel via railways, but it wasn't ideal for individual urban vehicles. Early steam carriages were heavy, dangerous, and frightened horses, creating more problems than they solved in city traffic. Electric trams offered one solution. Fixed-route public transport could be electrified using overhead wires or conduits under the street. By 1901, electric trams were replacing horse trams in many British cities. They were faster, cleaner, and more humane. "No more waiting for tired horses to drag us uphill," one regular commuter might remark. "These electric trams fair zip along." "And no more manure," his companion would add. "My wife says my boots are actually clean when I get home now." But trams, like railways, were fixed-route systems. They couldn't provide the flexible point-to-point transportation that horses had offered. For that, something else was needed. Enter the automobile. The first practical motor cars appeared in Britain in the 1890s, mostly imported from France and Germany at first. They were expensive novelties for the wealthy, still far from practical everyday transport for the masses. Early motorists were pioneers in the truest sense, driving temperamental machines on roads designed for horses, with no gas stations, repair shops, traffic signals, or even driving tests. Every journey was an adventure, and possibly a breakdown waiting to happen. "How far did you get this time?" one early motorist might ask another. "Made it almost to Guildford before the transmission gave out. Had to be towed the last 5 miles by a farm horse. Damned embarrassing. Better than last month when your steering failed and you ended up in the duck pond. Don't remind me. I'm still finding feathers in the upholstery." The most significant legal restriction on early motoring in Britain was the infamous Red Flag Act, officially the Locomotive Act of 1865. This law required that all self-propelled vehicles on public roads be accompanied by a crew of 3, observe a speed limit of 4 mph in the country and 2 mph in towns, be preceded by a man on foot carrying a red flag to warn of the vehicle's approach. Imagine trying to travel any distance when you couldn't go faster than a walking pace and needed to pay 3 people, driver, stoker, engineer and flag person, to operate the vehicle. It effectively killed the development of road automobiles in Britain for decades. The French and Germans race ahead while we crawl behind a red flag, one inventor complained. Britain will be left behind in the dust. The restrictions were finally eased in 1896, raising the speed limit to a blistering 14 km and removing the red flag requirement. To celebrate, motorists organised the first London to Brighton run, a drive that continues as a historic event to this day. The transformative potential of the automobile was obvious to some forward-thinking Victorians. Here was a vehicle that promised the flexibility of horse transport without the manure problem, that could potentially be affordable enough for middle-class families, and that might finally solve the urban transport crisis. But others saw only problems. Early cars were noisy, smoky, and frightening to horses, causing accidents when nervous animals bolted. They were mechanically unreliable, and they put yet another category of working people, those involved with horse transport, at risk of unemployment. What will become of the coachmen and stable hands, one concerned citizen might ask. Same thing that happened to the stagecoach drivers when railways came. Adapt or starve, would be the unsentimental reply. And the horses? Dog food, most likely. The transition would be neither quick nor smooth. Horses, railways, electric trams, bicycles and motor vehicles would share roads in an uncomfortable mix for decades to come. Each had advantages and disadvantages. Each served particular needs and particular classes of travellers. As Queen Victoria's reign ended with her death in 1901, the transportation landscape of Britain was a complex patchwork of overlapping systems. The great railway network connected major towns and cities. Urban areas had their underground railways, trams and omnibuses. Rural areas still relied heavily on horses and carts, with infrequent rail service if they were lucky enough to have a local station. For ordinary people, the experience of travel had been transformed within a single lifetime. Someone born in 1830, who had grown up with stagecoaches as the fastest land transport, could have lived to see automobiles, electric underground railways, and even the earliest airplanes. The acceleration of change was unprecedented. When I was a boy, an elderly gentleman might tell his grandchildren in 1900, it took 3 days to reach London from York. Now it's 4 hours by express train. The world has shrunk before my eyes. And soon, his grandson might reply, motor cars will be everywhere. They say we'll cross the country in a single day. Nonsense, the old man would scoff. Nothing will replace the railway. These motor cars are just toys for rich eccentrics. Time would prove him wrong, of course, but the railway network created by the Victorians would remain the backbone of British transport well into the 20th century. Even today, much of Britain's rail infrastructure follows routes laid out in the Victorian period. The same is true of much urban transport infrastructure. The London Underground lines built by the Victorians still carry passengers today. Victorian railway stations, appropriately modernised, still serve their original purpose. The road networks, widened and improved for automobile traffic, often follow patterns established for horse-drawn vehicles. This persistence of Victorian infrastructure into the modern age is a testament to the ambition and engineering skill of the era. The Victorians built to last, creating transportation systems designed to serve for generations. They also established patterns of travel behaviour that remain with us: the daily commute, the weekend excursion, the summer holiday, trip. These rhythms of movement, which seem so natural to us now, were innovations in the Victorian period, made possible by new transportation technologies. The social impacts were equally lasting. The expansion of horizons that came with increased mobility changed how people thought about distance, community, and opportunity. The Victorian transportation revolution broke down geographical barriers that had limited people's lives for centuries. Consider the mental world of a pre-railway villager. Their concept of geography might extend no more than 20 miles in any direction, the distance that could be comfortably walked in a day. Towns beyond that range existed as names on maps, perhaps occasionally visited for special markets or events, but not part of everyday reality. The railway network expanded that mental map dramatically. Places previously known only by name became accessible destinations. Regional accents and customs that had developed in isolation began to blend as people moved more freely between areas. Local identities remained important, but they existed within a stronger sense of national connection. "You're not from around here," a shopkeeper might observe from a customer's accent. "No, I'm from Newcastle originally." "Newcastle? That's hundreds of miles away. What brings you to Bristol?" "Work, mainly. The railway company transferred me last year. But I can visit home in a day if I need to. Morning train up, evening train back." Such casual mobility across hundreds of miles would have been almost unthinkable before railways. The ability to maintain family connections despite geographical separation changed how people thought about migration and employment opportunities. The Victorians also pioneered the concept of commuting, living in one community while working in another. This separation of home and workplace was a radical break from traditional patterns where people typically lived very close to, or even at, their place of work. The commuter lifestyle, with its daily rhythm of departure and return, created new social patterns. Commuter communities developed distinct characteristics, often serving as dormitories for workers while maintaining a separate identity from the urban centres they served. "How's life in Surbiton?" a city worker might ask a colleague. "Quiet, clean. The wife loves the garden. Children have good schools." "Don't you find the daily train journey tedious?" "I read the newspaper, chat with the regulars. It's my transition time. Leave work behind, prepare for family life." These commuter patterns established in the Victorian period would intensify in the 20th century as automobile ownership expanded. The suburbs would grow far beyond railway lines once cars provided flexible personal transportation. But the fundamental concept of living at a distance from one's workplace was a Victorian innovation. The physical infrastructure of transportation also transformed the appearance and function of towns and cities. Railway stations became new focal points, often replacing traditional market squares or high streets as centres of activity. Station approaches developed into commercial district with hotels, shops, and services catering to travellers. "Meet me under the clock at Paddington" became a common arrangement, establishing the great railway terminals as landmarks and meeting places. Towns fortunate enough to be on main railway lines prospered and grew. Those bypassed by the network often stagnated or declined. The pattern of development followed the iron rails, creating winners and losers in the Victorian transport lottery. This used to be the main road to London, an innkeeper might lament standing in his empty tap room. 40 coaches a day stopped here. Now the railway's 10 miles away, and we're lucky to see 4 customers a week. Why not move to the railway town, a traveller might suggest, and compete with the new hotel built right outside the station? With what money? We're stuck here watching our livelihood die by inches. Such economic displacement was the dark side of transportation progress. New systems created new opportunities but often destroyed old ones in the process. The benefits and costs were rarely distributed equally. As you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, so far removed from the noise, smell and danger of Victorian streets, consider how their transportation revolution shaped the world we inhabit today. The commuter patterns, the weekend leisure trips, the summer holidays, the sprawling suburbs, all have their roots in Victorian innovations. Next time, we'll explore how these transportation changes affected different social classes and regions of Britain, from the industrial north to the rural south, from the urban poor to the rural aristocracy. The story of Victorian travel continues, with each mile of rail and road writing a new chapter in the nation's development. The transportation revolution didn't affect all Britons equally. Your experience of Victorian travel depended heavily on who you were, where you lived, and, most importantly, how much money you had. Let's explore how these different worlds of travel existed side by side in the same country. For the aristocracy and wealthy upper classes, travel was a remarkably comfortable affair. They moved through a carefully cushioned world, protected from the inconveniences that plagued ordinary travellers. Picture the Earl of Somewhere departing his London townhouse for a journey to his country estate. He doesn't worry about timetables or ticket prices. His staff handle all the tedious details. His valet has packed his trunks. His coachman has prepared his private carriage. His footman will ensure everything runs smoothly. "When will you require the carriage, my lord?" his butler might ask. "Have it ready at 10. We'll catch the 11:15 express from Paddington. Telegraph the estate to have the house ready by dinner. Time." "Very good, my lord. I've taken the liberty of reserving a private compartment for your journey." When the Earl travels by train, he doesn't mingle with the general public. Railway companies provided first-class waiting rooms, often lavishly appointed with fireplaces, comfortable furniture and attendants. Some major stations even had separate entrances and platforms for first-class passengers. Once aboard, the wealthy traveller enjoyed a level of comfort that would make modern business class look austere. The first-class compartments on premier routes featured upholstered seats, thick carpets, reading lamps, and even toilet facilities in later years. Refreshments could be ordered and served by attentive staff. For longer journeys, dining cars offered multi-course meals with white tablecloths and silver service. "The grouse is excellent today, Sir William," a dining car attendant might suggest. "Very well. And a bottle of the Bordeaux." "Certainly, sir, and for the lady." "My wife will have the salmon. She finds red meat difficult to digest while travelling." For the wealthiest travellers, even these accommodations might be insufficient. They could hire entire private carriages or special saloon cars for their exclusive use. The royal family and aristocracy often travelled in custom-built carriages designed to their personal specifications. When they reached their destination, the upper classes would be met by their own carriages or by hired conveyances arranged in advance. They never carried their own luggage or navigated unfamiliar streets. Their entire travel experience was a seamless progression from door to door, managed by an invisible army of servants and railway staff. For the growing middle classes, travel was comfortable, but required more personal management. A successful merchant or professional might travel first class on important business trips, but opt for second class for routine journeys. His wife might use second class when travelling alone, combining economy with propriety. "Will you take first class to Glasgow, sir?" a clerk might ask as his employer prepares for a business trip. "Yes, for myself, but second class tickets will suffice for my assistants. We're not made of money." Middle-class families embraced the new mobility offered by improved transportation, particularly for leisure. The Victorian era saw the birth of tourism as we know it today, with Thomas Cook organising his first excursion in 1841, a one-day rail journey from Leicester to Loughborough for a temperance meeting. From these modest beginnings grew the concept of the package tour, with Cook and similar entrepreneurs arranging transportation, accommodation, and sightseeing for middle-class travellers. "Have you seen Cook's tour of the continent?" a doctor's wife might ask at a tea party. 3 weeks in France, Switzerland, and Italy, all arrangements handled for 40 guineas. But is it quite proper, travelling with strangers? Perfectly respectable. The Wilkinsons did it last summer and encountered a bishop's family in their tour group. They've engaged to marry their eldest daughter to the bishop's nephew. This emerging tourism created new patterns of leisure travel. The seaside holiday became a middle-class institution. Resorts like Scarborough, Bournemouth and Torquay developed specifically to cater to this market, with promenades, pleasure piers, and respectable entertainments. The aspirational middle classes used transportation choices as markers of status, taking the right class of railway carriage, summoning the right type of cab, or promenading on the fashionable routes at the correct times were all ways of demonstrating one's place in society. "We always take first class to Brighton," a banker's wife might boast to her friends. "For the whole family? How extravagant," another replies, impressed but slightly disapproving. "Well, not for the nursemaid, of course. She travels third class with the children's luggage." For the lower middle classes, clerks, shopkeepers, skilled artisans, transportation was a more carefully budgeted concern. They might stretch to second-class tickets for special occasions, but generally travelled third class. As the century progressed, third-class accommodations improved dramatically, partly due to the 1844 Railway Act, which required companies to run at least one train daily on every line with third-class carriages at a fare of no more than a penny per mile. "Is it true you're taking the family to Margate this summer?" one clerk might ask another. "Yes, third-class excursion tickets. 5 shillings return for adults, half price for the children. Can't afford more with 4 little ones, but they've never seen the sea." How can you manage even that on your salary? Been putting 6pence aside every week since Christmas. Some things are worth saving for. The working classes experience transportation very differently. For urban workers, walking remained the primary mode of getting around for most of the Victorian period. A labourer might walk several miles each way to and from work every day. Only gradually did affordable public transportation, horse trams and later electric trams, make mechanised travel accessible to working people. When workers did use trains, it was typically for special excursions rather than routine travel. Railway companies occasionally offered workmen's fares, heavily discounted tickets on early morning trains to bring labourers into cities, or excursion specials for bank holidays. "Did you hear about the special to Crystal Palace on Easter Monday?" one factory worker might tell another. 6pence return from Leeds, children half price. 6pence? That's still a day's wages for some. Aye, but worth it to give the little ones a day out. My eldest has never been further than the next town. The urban poor rarely travelled for pleasure. Their horizons remained limited by cost and opportunity. A day's wages lost to travel time could mean the difference between eating and going hungry. The concept of leisure travel was an unaffordable luxury for many. Rural workers were even more isolated. A farm labourer in a remote village might never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace in their entire life. Even if there was a railway station within walking distance, the cost of tickets was prohibitive on agricultural wages. "Have you ever been to London?" a visitor might ask a village elder. "London? What would I want there? Never been further than Market Town, and that's far enough. Don't hold with gadding about." Behind the words perhaps lay a fear of the unknown and the economic reality that such travel was simply impossible on 15 shillings a week. For both urban and rural poor, major life events might be the only justification for significant travel. Migrating for work, fleeing hardship, or joining family members who had already moved away were common reasons for the working classes to undertake long journeys. The growth of employment in industrial centres drew millions of people from rural areas to towns and cities throughout the Victorian period. These internal migrants often made their journeys in stages, walking as far as they could, then perhaps using a carrier's cart or paying for the cheapest possible train ticket for the final distance. "How did you get from Cornwall to Manchester?" a new factory worker might be asked. "Walked most of the way, took near 3 weeks, slept in barns or under hedges, had just enough saved for the train fare from Birmingham for the last bit." 3 weeks? With your family? "Wife and little ones came after, when I'd earned enough to send for them. Took the parliamentary train, cheapest way." The parliamentary train was a result of legislation requiring railways to provide at least some service affordable to working people, usually 1 train per day at a maximum fare of a penny per mile. These trains typically ran at inconvenient times, stopped at every minor station, and offered the most basic accommodation, but they were a lifeline for those who couldn't afford regular fares. Regional differences in transportation were stark. The industrial North and Midlands developed dense railway networks connecting manufacturing centres, while parts of rural Wales, Scotland and southwest England remained relatively isolated. Some remote communities were never connected to the railway network at all, continuing to rely on coastal shipping or road transport well into the 20th century. "When is the railway coming to our valley?" a Welsh slate miner might ask. "Never, likely. Not enough profit in it for the company. We'll keep hauling slate by cart to the coast like we've always done." Even where railways existed, the service varied dramatically. Main lines between major cities saw frequent express trains with the latest comforts. Branch lines to market towns might get only a few trains per day, often using older hand-me-down rolling stock retired from premier routes. "How often does the train stop here?" a visitor might ask at a rural station. "Tuesday and Friday, market days. And there's the mail train that passes through at 4 a.m, but it only stops if someone's flagged it down." Gender-shaped transportation experiences across all classes. Victorian women face particular challenges when travelling. Concerns about propriety meant that respectable women, especially when travelling alone, had to be constantly vigilant about their behaviour and surroundings. "Never enter a railway compartment alone with a single gentleman," advice books warned. "Request the guard to find you a compartment with other ladies, or at least with families." Sexual harassment was a real concern on Victorian public transport, particularly in the isolated railway compartments, without corridors or any means of summoning help. Several high-profile cases of assaults on female passengers led to the introduction of communication cords, allowing passengers to alert the guard in emergencies. but these weren't widely implemented until late in the century. Women's clothing complicated travel enormously. The fashionable Victorian lady in the 1860s might wear a crinoline frame supporting voluminous skirts up to 6 feet in circumference. Navigating omnibus steps, railway carriage doors, or crowded pavements in such an outfit was a genuine physical challenge. "Did you hear about Mrs. Henderson's accident?" one lady might ask another. "No, what happened?" "Her crinoline caught in the carriage wheel as she was alighting, dragged her half down the street before the horses could be stopped. She's fortunate to have escaped with only bruises." How dreadful! I always have my footman check my skirts are clear before the carriage moves off. Later Victorian fashions, like the bustle, presented different but equally challenging obstacles to comfortable travel. Corsets restricted movement and breathing, making the physical exertion of travel more taxing. Heavy layers of clothing were stifling in summer, and still insufficient protection in winter in unheated vehicles. Women's travel was also constrained by social rules about appropriate behaviour and limitations on independent movement. Unmarried women of the middle and upper classes were rarely permitted to travel alone, requiring companions or chaperones. Working-class women had more freedom of movement by necessity, but faced greater physical dangers when travelling. For those with disabilities, Victorian travel presented nearly insurmountable barriers. No accommodations were made for wheelchair users. People with mobility impairments had to navigate steep steps, narrow doors, and crowded vehicles. The blind, deaf, and those with other disabilities travelled only with considerable assistance, or not at all. "My brother hasn't left the house in 15 years, one woman might confide to another. "Is he very ill?" "No, but his legs were crushed in a factory accident. He can't manage the stairs, let alone travel on public conveyances. The world outside might as well not exist for him now." Children's experience of travel varied dramatically by class. Upper and middle-class children might travel extensively with their families, or be sent alone on trains to boarding schools from a young age, entrusted to the care of guards and porters. "Young master's first time travelling alone," a mother might tell the guard, pressing a coin into his hand. "He's to be met at Rugby Station by the school. Don't you worry, mum, I'll keep an eye on him. Been taking young gentlemen to school for 20 years now." Working class children rarely travelled except when the entire family migrated for work. Their experience of transportation was often limited to walking, or perhaps occasional rides on horse trams. For many poor children, even a journey to the next town was an unimaginable adventure. The elderly faced their own challenges in the Victorian transportation system. No concessions were made for age. The same steep steps, crowded platforms, and exposure to weather had to be navigated by 80-year-olds as by 20-year-olds. For many elderly people, especially those with limited means, the difficulties of travel led to increasing isolation as they aged. "When did you last visit your daughter in Leeds?" a neighbour might ask an elderly widow. 5 years now. Can't manage the journey any more. My joints won't take the railway station steps, and I can't afford a cab at both ends." "Does she not come to you?" "She's in service, gets 1 half-day off a month, can hardly spend it travelling." The physical challenges of Victorian travel affected everyone, but fell most heavily on the vulnerable. Traffic accidents, platform falls, and injuries while boarding or alighting from vehicles were everyday occurrences. Without modern safety standards or accessibility requirements, the transportation system was designed for the young, able-bodied, and preferably affluent. Despite these difficulties, The Victorian transportation revolution gradually expanded horizons for all classes. By the end of the era, even working people could occasionally experience the freedom of movement that had once been the exclusive privilege of the wealthy. Bank holidays, established in 1871, gave workers guaranteed days off, and many used these for excursions. Railway companies offered special fares for these holidays, making day trips affordable even on modest incomes. The concept of leisure travel as a mass activity, rather than an elite privilege, was taking root. "Where's everyone going?" a visitor to London might ask, seeing crowds flooding into railway stations on an August bank holiday. Southend, Margate, Brighton, anywhere with a beach. Half the city empties out on days like this. They'll be back tonight, sunburnt and happy, having spent a day by the sea. All those people can afford such trips. Special excursion fares, and they save all year for these holidays, might be the only day out they get. For the poorest, transportation improvements eventually offered the hope of escape from desperate circumstances. Emigration to colonies like Australia, New Zealand and Canada became possible with cheaper steamship passages. While still a significant investment for a working family, cost gradually decreased to the point where it was an achievable dream rather than an impossible fantasy. "We're sailing next month," a factory worker might tell his neighbours. "Got assisted passages to Melbourne. Government there wants skilled workers." "How can you afford it with 5 children?" "Sold everything we own, and the wife's been taking in washing at night for 2 years. Every penny saved. It's our only chance for something better." Millions made such journeys, leaving Britain for new lives overseas. The same transportation revolution that connected the nation also facilitated this massive population movement. Between 1815 and 1914, around 15 million people emigrated from Britain, a staggering number given the total population was only about 36 million in 1900. As the Victorian era ended with the Queen's death in 1901, the transportation landscape had been transformed beyond recognition from the beginning of her reign in 1837. Yet the revolution was far from complete. The full impact of motor vehicles, electric trams and underground railways was still unfolding. The next generation would see even more dramatic changes, but the foundations had been laid. The core railway network was largely complete. Major urban centres had public transportation systems. The legal and regulatory frameworks for managing modern transport were taking shape. The patterns of commuting, tourism and leisure travel were established. The Victorian legacy in transportation was complex, simultaneously liberating and constraining, progressive and conservative, inclusive and exclusive. It reflected the contradictions of the age itself, with its combination of unprecedented technological innovation and rigid social hierarchies. For the traveller resting in a railway compartment as the 19th century drew to a close, looking out at the transformed landscape rushing by, the future direction of travel was becoming clear. The next century would build on Victorian foundations but take transportation in new directions. Faster, more democratic, and increasingly dominated by the motor car rather than the railway. As your eyes grow heavy in your comfortable modern bed, so different from the jolting Victorian railway carriage or swaying omnibus, consider how their transportation revolution shaped the world we inhabit. The commuter patterns, the weekend leisure trips, the summer holidays, all have their roots in Victorian innovations. Next time, we'll explore how the seeds planted in the Victorian era grew into the modern transportation systems of the 20th century, and how the end of the horse era transformed urban environments in ways both expected and surprising. The dawn of the 20th century marked not just the end of Queen Victoria's reign, but the beginning of a transportation transformation that would build directly on Victorian foundations while taking mobility in radical new directions. The seeds planted during those 6 decades of Victorian innovation were about to bloom in ways both expected and surprising. One of the most dramatic changes was the rapid disappearance of the horse from urban transportation. In 1901, London's streets were still dominated by thousands of horses pulling cabs, omnibuses, delivery wagons, and private carriages. By 1920, they had become a rarity, replaced by motor vehicles and electric trams. This transition happened with remarkable speed. In 1903, London had its first motorised bus service. By 1913, just 10 years later, the last horse-drawn omnibus made its final journey through the city. A transportation method that had dominated for centuries vanished in a single decade. "Look at that," an elderly Londoner might remark in 1913, watching the ceremonial last journey of a horse omnibus. "Never thought I'd see the day. What happens to all the horses now?" "Most already gone to the countryside or the army," his son might reply. "Some to the knacker's yard, I suppose." Progress marches on. Progress, all that noise and smoke. Give me a good horse any day. "You won't have the choice much longer, father." This disappearance of working horses from cities had profound consequences. The most immediate and welcome was the end of the manure crisis. Victorian cities had struggled with the public health nightmare of thousands of horses producing tons of manure daily. The shift to motor vehicles eliminated this particular problem almost overnight. "The streets are actually clean," a housewife might marvel around 1915. "Remember how we used to have to check our shoes carefully before entering the house? And the flies in summer," her husband would add. "Thousands of them breeding in the manure piles. Don't miss that at all. Still don't care for the smell of petrol and exhaust, though. Better than horse dung, my dear, and at least it doesn't stick to your boots." The urban landscape changed in other ways too. Stables, mews, and carriage houses became redundant. Horse troughs and hitching posts disappeared from streets. Blacksmiths and harness makers found their trades suddenly obsolete. Fodder merchants and ostlers had to find new occupations. The skills needed to maintain a horse-based transportation system, accumulated over centuries, became irrelevant within a generation. Knowledge about horse breeding, training and care, expertise in carriage design and harness making, the complex logistics of feeding, stabling and managing thousands of animals in an urban environment, all faded into unnecessary history. "What will you do now?" a former stable hand might be asked as the last horses were led away. "Motor garage offered me work. Said I know about transportation, just need to learn the new machines. Not sure I want to, though. Horses you can talk to. These motor engines just belch smoke and make a racket." For many workers in horse-related trades, the transition proved difficult. They had to adapt quickly or face unemployment. Some successfully transferred their skills. Carriage makers became automobile bodybuilders, for instance. Others found themselves suddenly without a livelihood, their lifetime of experience rendered worthless by technological change. Yet the advantages of motorized transport were undeniable. Motor vehicles didn't tire or fall ill. They didn't need to rest. They could work as long as fuel was available. They were faster, more powerful, and ultimately more efficient than horses for most transportation purposes. The urban soundscape changed dramatically too. The constant clip-clop of thousands of hooves on cobblestones, the jingling of harnesses, the shouts of drivers, these sounds that had defined city life for centuries faded away, replaced by the rumble of engines, the honking of horns, and the screech of brakes. "The city sounds different now," an old man might observe. "Used to be you could tell who was coming by the sound of their horses. Knew Mr. Phillips had a loose shoe on his left front, knew the brewery dray by its heavy tread. Now it's all the same mechanical growl." "You're just getting nostalgic in your old age," his daughter might tease. "You used to complain about the noise of the horses keeping you awake at night. At least that was a living sound. These machines, they have no soul." The smell of the city changed too, from the organic odours of horse manure, sweat, and hay to the chemical smells of gasoline, oil, and exhaust. The transition wasn't necessarily an improvement in air quality, just a different kind of pollution, but it was a profound sensory shift in urban experience. Motor vehicles also changed the pace and rhythm of city traffic. Horses had natural speed limitations. They tired. They slowed on hills. They needed rest breaks. These natural constraints had set a tempo of urban movement for centuries. Mechanical vehicles had different limitations. They could maintain higher speeds for longer periods, accelerate more quickly, and operate continuously if drivers were changed. Traffic patterns had to be completely rethought to accommodate these new capabilities and dangers. "Another accident at that same corner," a policeman might report. "Third this month. These motorists don't understand you can't take a bend at 20 miles an hour. Anyone killed? Not this time. Knocked over a fruit stand and injured 2 pedestrians. Driver says his brakes failed." They always say that. Truth is they're going too fast for conditions and don't know how to handle the machines properly. Road safety became a serious concern as speeds increased. Victorian traffic, for all its chaos, had operated at a pace where serious accidents, though common, were often survivable. A pedestrian hit by a horse or a slow-moving carriage might escape with injuries. The same pedestrian hit by a motor car at 20 miles per hour faced much worse odds. The first driving tests were not introduced in Britain until 1935, so the early decades of motoring saw essentially untrained drivers operating increasingly powerful vehicles on roads designed for horse traffic. The results were predictably lethal. Traffic fatalities rose steadily as motor vehicles became more common. New road rules and signals had to be developed to manage motorised traffic. The first electric traffic light in Britain was installed in London in 1926. Road markings, traffic signs, speed limits, and other regulatory tools we now take for granted were innovations developed in response to the new dangers of motor vehicles. Meanwhile, the railways that had defined Victorian transportation entered a period of consolidation rather than expansion. The main network was largely complete by 1900. The Railways Act of 1921 amalgamated the numerous private railway companies into 4 major companies, the Big Four of the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, LMS, the London and North Eastern Railway, LENA, the Great Western Railway, GWR, and the Southern Railway, SR. This consolidation brought greater standardization and efficiency, but didn't fundamentally change the passenger experience. Railway travel in the 1920s would have been recognizable to a Victorian traveller, with improvements in comfort and speed but the same basic service patterns. My grandfather took this same journey in 1870, a passenger might remark in 1920. Said it took 3 hours then. We'll do it in just under 2 today. Progress, eh? Though I hear they've actually reduced services on some branch lines. Not enough profit in them, apparently. This was the beginning of a pattern that would intensify later. As road transport improved, railway companies focused increasingly on profitable main lines and reduced service to smaller communities. The comprehensive network that the Victorians had built began a slow contraction that would accelerate after World War II. Urban public transportation, however, continued to develop and expand on Victorian foundations. Electric trams, first introduced in the late Victorian period, became the dominant form of urban transit in the early 20th century. By 1920, nearly every major British city had an extensive tram network. London's underground system, begun by the Victorians, expanded significantly with new lines and electrification. The deep-level tube lines that the Victorians had pioneered with the City and South London Railway were joined by similar lines: the Central London Railway, 1900, the Piccadilly, 1906, and the Northern, 1907, among others. It's remarkable, a visitor to London might observe in the 1920s. You can cross the entire city without ever seeing daylight. Some people do exactly that. Live in suburbs, work in the city, travel entirely underground. My cousin says he once went 3 days in winter without seeing the sun, left for work in darkness, spent all day in an office, travelled by underground, and returned home after sunset. Sounds rather grim. Efficient, though, and warmer than waiting for buses in the rain. The electrification of these underground railways eliminated the smoke problem that had plagued the early steam-operated lines. The passenger environment improved dramatically, though the crowds and noise remained challenging, especially during rush hours. This growth of urban public transport created new patterns of suburban development. Electric trams and underground railways could move large numbers of people quickly between residential areas and workplaces. Housing developments specifically designed around transit stops, early examples of what we now call transit-oriented development, sprang up around London and other cities. Why did you choose Golders Green? One commuter might ask another on the Northern Line in the 1920s. Direct tube line to my office in the city, 25 minutes door to door. Couldn't afford anything closer, and the air's cleaner out there for the children. You should see the gardens some of the houses have. Any shops, cinemas, that sort of thing. All developing around the station. Wasn't much there 5 years ago, but now it's quite civilized. Amazing what a railway station can do for a neighborhood. These transit-based suburbs created a new kind of urban geography, the metropolis as a collection of interconnected villages rather than a continuous urban mass. People might work in one area, live in another, and socialize in a third, using public transport to move between these different spaces. For the middle classes, this period saw the beginnings of mass car ownership, though nothing like the levels that would come after World War II. By the late 1920s, cars were becoming affordable to professionals, small business owners, and the upper middle class. For these early adopters, the automobile offered unprecedented freedom of movement. Just got the new Morris, a doctor might mention to colleagues in 1925. Marvellous machine. Took the family to Bournemouth last weekend. Door to door in our own time, no railway timetables to worry about. What about breakdowns? I hear these things are terribly unreliable. Had a puncture on the way back, fixed it myself in half an hour. Bit of grease on the suit, but small price to pay for the convenience. This private mobility changed leisure patterns. The railway had made seaside resorts beauty spots accessible, but visitors were still constrained by train schedules and established tourist facilities clustered around stations. The car allowed people to explore more remote areas and travel on their own schedules. New kinds of tourist facilities developed to serve these motorists. Roadside cafes, motels, viewing spots with parking areas. The relationship between transportation and landscape changed as roads, rather than railway lines, became the primary arteries of movement and visibility. For the working classes, bicycles remained the most accessible form of private transport. Mass production, had made bicycles increasingly affordable, and they offered significant mobility advantages without the costs of motorized transport. By the 1920s, the bicycle was firmly established as the working person's vehicle. "Got a new bike on the instalment plan," a factory worker might tell his mates proudly. 3 shillings a week for a year, worth every penny, saves me 6pence a day in tram fares, and I'm not stuck waiting when I work late. What about when it rains? Get wet. Still better than standing around for half an hour waiting for a tram that's already full. The growing accessibility of bicycles particularly benefited working women, continuing the emancipatory effect that had begun in the Victorian period. A woman with a bicycle had independent mobility that allowed for greater employment options, social connections and leisure activities. For rural areas, the transportation revolution came more slowly. Many villages remained poorly served by public transport well into the 20th century. The motor bus gradually replaced or supplemented railway services, reaching communities that had never had rail connections. But frequency remained limited, and rural residents often had to plan their lives around sparse transportation schedules. "Bus comes on Tuesday and Friday," a village shopkeeper might explain to a visitor. "Market days. If you need to go to town any other day, you're out of luck unless you know someone with a car." What about emergencies? Medical problems? Doctor visits once a week. Anything serious, someone has to cycle 8 miles to the next village with a telephone to call an ambulance. Been that way for years. This rural isolation would persist until mass car ownership after World War II finally brought personal mobility to most of the population. Until then, the transportation inequality between urban and rural areas that had begun in the Victorian period continued and in some ways intensified. The class divisions in transportation also persisted, though in evolving forms. The wealthy now had chauffeur-driven cars rather than carriages. The middle classes had their own cars or used first-class rail services. The working classes relied on public transport, bicycles, or simply walking. The basic hierarchy remained intact, just with updated technologies. By the 1930s, the foundations of modern transportation were firmly established. The motor vehicle had displaced the horse. Public transport networks served urban areas. The railway system connected major population centres. Civil aviation was in its infancy but growing. The basic elements of the 20th century transportation landscape were in place, building directly on Victorian innovations while taking them in new directions. The Victorian legacy in transportation was profound and enduring. The physical infrastructure they created, railway lines, stations, bridges, tunnels, remained in use for generations, much of it still functioning today. The organisational systems they developed, timetables, tickets, traffic regulations, evolved but persisted in recognisable forms. Most importantly, the social and cultural patterns established in the Victorian period, commuting, tourism, the weekend break, the summer holiday, became fundamental to modern life. These weren't just ways of moving, they were ways of living that shaped communities, families, and individual experiences. As you drift further towards sleep, think about how these Victorian innovations still echo in your own life, in the commute you might make each day, in the weekend trips to the coast or countryside, in the summer holidays to distant places. We still move through patterns they established, along routes they surveyed, with expectations of mobility they created. Next time, we'll complete our journey through Victorian travel by looking at the lasting legacy of their transportation revolution, not just in physical infrastructure, but in how it fundamentally changed the way people understood distance, time, opportunity, and community. We'll see how the world they set in motion continues to shape our lives today, and what lessons their experience might offer for our own transportation challenges. The Victorian transportation revolution wasn't just about getting from place to place more quickly. It fundamentally changed how people understood their world, their